Chapter 3 of Hope Deferred. Susan got back on the train. The trip, not as long this time, still whispered to Susan's fears and remembered pain, but the hope she still steadily held drowned it out. She refused to think about what would happen if Mrs. McCready did not know or would not see her. The idea did not bear thinking about, and that was that. The stop came, and Susan disembarked. The apartment building, clearly visible from a platform, was indeed not far off. Susan left the platform. Here she could walk. It was another quiet town, an actual town, buildings in every direction, but mostly small and old and still with dirt streets, a compromise of city and country. Susan took in a breath, lifted her head again, and strode forward. She faced her memories. Surely she could face a strict housekeeper. She had faced strict housekeepers in the past. Granted, she'd usually been on their side, but not always. If facing another meant getting her past life back, then it was something she'd gladly do. She arrived. She walked up to the door, read the names listed by the apartment numbers. This must be a newer building, she realized. Was it her imagination, or the letters McCready just slightly more orderly and straight? Apartment 3B. She let herself in, walked the straight, narrow hall, and arrived at a wooden door with a golden 3B hanging on it. She straightened her posture, raised her hand, and gently knocked. A few even, swift footsteps sounded inside, coming closer and closer. Then the door opened. A very old woman, still with her hair pulled back into a precise bun, but more comfortably clad, stood looking at the sad, beautiful woman. "I know your face," she said, "but I do not recall someone of such looks among my acquaintance." Susan swallowed. Mrs. Richards had been quite right. "You knew me when I was younger." "I'm Susan Penvesey, one of the 4 war orphans." Susan almost closed her eyes. That haunting word. There had to be a word for losing both parents, because that kind of grief could not go unexpressed. She hadn't been an orphan then, but she was now. "Susan Penvesey, second eldest, and most sensible if I remember correctly, which I'm sure I do." "Well, come in and rest yourself. The hallway is no place for a young lady to remain." "Thank you, Mrs. McCready." Susan entered the small hall, noting the decorations, sparse, plain, generally white, but in good taste, and the 2 chairs in the living area. "Tea?" said Mrs. McCready, and Susan shook her head, sitting down when Mrs. McCready motioned. "I'm here to ask a question, if you would be so kind," said Susan. She folded her hands in her lap, the better to hide their trembling. "I visited the old mansion today, and Mrs. Richards was kind enough to show me around." Mrs. McCready said nothing, still regarding Susan with those uncomfortably sharp eyes. "We went up to that room that had once been empty, except for a large wardrobe, and the wardrobe was missing. Do you remember where the wardrobe went?" Do you, thudded Susan's heart. Mrs. McCready folded her hands in her lap. "I remember that wardrobe. All 4 of you, 5 of you, after you spent some time with the professor, had the oddest habit of visiting it. When your sister looked like she felt like crying, she'd fold herself up into a corner of it. Since she quite sensibly left the door open and did not shut herself in, I never interfered." Susan's throat caught again. She hadn't known that about Lucy, but it was such a Lucy thing to do. "Your brothers went there sometimes, just to touch it, and the professor went knocking on the back of it once, as if testing to see if it was hollow." Her tone implied such a silly man, but I am much too well-bred to say so. Mrs. McCready continued. "The wardrobe was a great treasure to him, but it hadn't first belonged to the house, and the new owners thought it was too big and a waste of space." Too big, thought Susan, an entire country inside of it. They sold it along with a great deal of other furniture to Messrs. Paddington and Henry on Grace Church Street in London, England. They should have the wardrobe, or at least a record of the sale. Susan's sigh was all of relief. Mrs. Macready had remembered. Susan had a direction to follow. You never went near it, I noticed. I did not care to then, said Susan. I was trying to see the world for what it was, outside the wardrobe. She rose, smoothing her dress. I cannot thank you enough, Mrs. Macready, for remembering this and allowing me my questions. Mrs. Macready nodded and tilted her head towards the door, a clear goodbye, and Susan went. I was sorry to hear of his train accident, said Mrs. Macready. Susan paused just before reaching the door. Mrs. Macready hadn't risen, but she wasn't looking at Susan now. She was looking down, remembering. I beg your pardon, said Susan. Mrs. Macready raised her head, and Susan, with all the insight her own sorrow had given, saw the pain felt, repressed, and yet still so heart-achingly clear in that strict face. The professor was, for all his eccentricities, one of the best and most generous men I have ever known. He was rarely on time for dinner, but he was always in the right place for a hurting soul. There was not a thing he owned he would not give away if a person needed it, and he had the wisdom to see true needs and not be taken in by false ones. I meant to visit him sometime, only I never found the time, and one day the newspaper informed me there was no time. I read your siblings' names there too, and 2 names above them that were likely your parents. And my cousin, said Susan, and my friend, and the professor's friend. Everyone who ever cared about Narnia or the wardrobe. Polly Plummer. Her name was Polly Plummer, said Mrs. Macready. Her eyes were on Susan again. I do hope you find that wardrobe or whatever else you are looking for. Susan, again nearly blind with tears, whispered a thank you and slipped out.